to Ellie, Saima, Helen, and Aaron for organizing the event. Which, when the call for papers was sent round, I immediately thought, "Oh, this looks really interesting. I'd love to do something for this." And I wasn't able to put a paper together, but Ellie got in touch and asked whether I'd like to do a short introduction to the day. So I said yes, absolutely. So I'm just going to share a few slides with you. I've done some research on contemporary collecting, probably less work with contemporary collecting than many of you, but it's also a topic I teach on the MA Museum Studies at the University of York. And so I thought I'd do a very short kind of background introduction to contemporary collecting, and then pulling out some of the themes that are highlighted in the abstract that was sent in for today. I'm not going to hold anyone to task in terms of what they said in their abstract versus what they end up saying in the presentation, but just a couple of general observations I thought I'd make. So, contemporary collecting, what is it? Well, it has to do with collecting objects, material culture, but also can be connected to oral histories or photographs or other things related to contemporary events, contemporary everyday objects, and it could also be new objects relating to contemporary art, for example, could also fall into this category. And different institutions approach this kind of work in different ways. And this is one example. This photo is taken from the V&A. So this is one of the pussy hats from the Women's March in Washington, D.C. in response to the election of Donald Trump as president. And the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, a design museum, is one of the museums that does work around contemporary collecting. And so they call their work rapid response collecting, and they describe it as a program of work that was introduced in 2014 as a new type of collecting activity at the V&A. Contemporary objects are acquired in response to major moments in recent history that touch the world of design and manufacturing. Many of the objects have been newsworthy, either because they advance what design can do, or because they reveal truths about how we live. And so one of the things that they're doing in the statement, obviously, is connecting this work of rapid response collecting to the core work of what they do as their mission as an institution, as a design museum, explaining why this work is relevant to their mission as a museum. And this is an important principle that's often pulled out in terms of guides or recommendations for contemporary collecting work, especially when working with more controversial subjects, so that if you're challenged on why you're doing this work, why you're collecting these things, then it's very clear you can explain that it's connected to your collection development policy, for example, to your mission as a museum. And so I've pulled out these quotes from Leeds Museums and Galleries web pages. So this is one of the largest local authority museums in the UK, in the north of England, that I've done quite a bit of work with. And so and they do work around contemporary collecting. And so I've pulled out these statements in relation to some of their key mission and strategy documents that show how the kind of contemporary collecting work that they do can be connected back to the core of their institutions and what they do as organizations. So in their mission, they say, we work with communities to share stories from our past and present to shape a better future for the people of Leeds. And on their pages around donating to the collection, they in that call for donations, they say that Leeds Museums and Galleries are committed to collecting objects and stories that reflect contemporary Leeds people and our city and region's diverse communities. And it will come as no surprise to most of you that, and this I guess is a recurring issue in the sector in relation to our workforce, but also in relation to our collections, that they don't necessarily reflect the communities that we serve and that we say that our organizations are for. And so this is a statement within Leeds's strategic documents explaining why they might be doing work around contemporary collecting to diversify their collections and make their collections more representative. So what kinds of museums do this kind of contemporary collecting work? And those of you who work in museums may see your museums represented on this screen, either specifically named or within these categories at the top. And so my sense is that the types of museums that do the most commonly do contemporary collecting work often fall into these categories of being local authority museums. So they collect material culture relating to a specific geographic region, and that also includes more contemporary objects. Design museums like the V&A, because design keeps on evolving. Science and industry museums, again, in order to explain and introduce contemporary developments in science and industry. And then campaigning museums. And some of these different specific museums taken from the UK that fall under these different types of categories that do contemporary collecting work are highlighted on this slide, or that did in the past. So if we think about what can we do to do contemporary collecting well, there are a few different guides that have been developed, and some of the best ones are developed by people on this call. In terms of the ethics of contemporary collecting, for example, that Ellie Miles and colleagues developed recently. There are also some other articles in the kind of academic literature that talk about principles for contemporary collecting. And one of the ones that I often highlight is this article from 2019 by Deborah Tolani Salahuddin about work collecting and documenting the Black Lives Matters movement in the US at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution. And the first principle you can see here connects back to this point that I raised earlier about ensuring that there's a really strong rationale and a clear purpose for the contemporary collecting work that you're doing that aligns with the museum's mission. And then she outlined a number of different principles that you might want to think about when initiating a contemporary collecting project. And these relate to things like scale and numbers. We know that many museum stores are already full, and so this places constraints on how we go about doing contemporary collecting work. Adding new objects to our collections, that we shouldn't make assumptions about people and whether or not they'd like to donate their objects, either assuming that they would or assuming that they wouldn't. Keep your colleagues on board in terms of the types of objects you collect, so what kind of conservation needs these objects might require. And then consider your documentation systems and whether they need to be amended in order to capture and accurately document the objects you're collecting in terms of how they might be used in the future. And so she writes in relation to this article that they decided to add a new keyword to their database in relation to Black Lives Matters to specifically have objects tagged in their database for future exhibition work, etc. So is contemporary collecting new? I think we often think that it is. And my sense certainly, and you'll know from your organizations, we saw from the V&A that their rapid response work started in 2014. My sense certainly is that a lot more museums are doing this kind of work now than maybe they were in the past. But there've been similar types of work going on for a long time. And so one of these examples that's often mentioned, certainly by academics, is the Swedish example, Samduk, which is the name is bring together the Swedish words for contemporary and for documentation. Their kind of tagline was collecting today for tomorrow, and it was this loose or kind of a collaboration between different museums in Sweden centered around Nordiska Museet that had 75 members back in 2006 and had these different working groups or pools. And so museums could choose which of the working groups they wanted to be part of. And some of these ran from the beginning and some of them were developed later. And so it's an example of saying that museums collecting contemporary objects isn't necessarily new, but it's certainly happening more now. And I think there's more guidance and more discussion around contemporary collecting now than there was before, but that doesn't mean that it's not still a challenging topic. And that's why it's so great that there are events like the one today, where we can share experiences and perspectives and kind of learn together from as practices evolving. So on a personal level, I worked on this research project called Heritage Futures back in 2018 and 2019. So I joined the project towards the end, and I worked on the profusion theme of this project, which was all about how museums and people in their homes decide what to keep in the face of mass production and consumption. So it wasn't explicitly about contemporary collecting, but it was focused on mass-produced everyday objects that museums collect. And that kind of work often falls under contemporary collecting. And so it is a phrase and a word that we use quite a lot in the work that we were doing. So this is led by Professor Sharon MacDonald, who's now based at the Humboldt University in Berlin. and together with Jenny Morgan, who's now a senior lecturer at the University of Stirling in Scotland. And so the work that I did here was in 2018 doing a national survey and a knowledge exchange event around contemporary collecting and disposal. And we produced this, this report that's freely accessible online. And we also wrote some other publications, and there's a book from the Heritage Futures Project where there's a section on profusion, so all about contemporary collecting, collections development, decision making, and also disposal and transfer in terms of removing objects from collections as well, which often is connected or can be connected to contemporary collecting work. And so some of the work that I've done since has been under the umbrella of the Museum of Tat, which is this new venture, a brainchild of Linda Burrell, who's the creative director at Museum and the National Caribbean Heritage Museum, which is a museum without walls, but based out of Nottingham in the UK. And we had an event, an exhibition this summer at Leeds Industrial Museum, where we'd taken on some deaccessioned material from Leeds Museums and Galleries from their social history collection, working with Kitty Ross, a curator there, who's done a lot of contemporary collecting work. And then we worked with 3 local artists to make new things with some of these unwanted objects. And so it's a project that fits in some ways within the contemporary collecting umbrella. The things that we're working with are pre-existing museum objects, but they're being transformed into new art objects, new things, and new meanings and narratives are being attached to them. And so in many ways, we are creating new museum objects that reflect contemporary issues. And I think both this work with the Museum of Tat, but also work with more conventional contemporary collecting is a really great opportunity to kind of re-envision our museums, our organizations, and think about what we want them to be in the future. It's transformative work where we're quite literally changing the makeup, I guess, of the institutions that we're in, which is part of what makes contemporary collecting so exciting. Because the rest of the work that we do, obviously, usually is working with inherited collections, with objects that other people in the past decided should sit within our museum. And those collections aren't necessarily representative or comprehensive, and so they set limitations, and we can work to respond to some of those limitations in contemporary collecting work, which some of the papers today will be talking about. Some contemporary collecting work is about these really high-profile, controversial objects relating to protests, to contemporary events, politics, etc., like the baby Trump blimp, that I believe both the People's History Museum in Manchester and the Museum of London wanted to collect, and things like the Fatberg, the Whitechapel Fatberg that was collected by the Museum of London. But there's so much more work around less kind of high-profile, controversial, headline-grabbing objects. And I think it's my sense from looking over the abstracts for the event today is that it's more, certainly most of the papers today will talk about some of that more kind of everyday type material culture that we collect and looking at making collections more representative in different ways. Another aspect to contemporary collecting is around digital collecting. And I didn't see, I don't think, in my reading of the abstracts today, any that were explicitly digital, but it'll be interesting to see how much that comes out in your papers today in terms of how much of the contemporary collecting work that you're doing, whether it's physical objects or whether it's also contemporary culture online. And some of the people doing work in this space, like Kaisa Hartig and Jenny Kidd, and of course Aaron Rees, who's also organizing this event. So we'll see if digital comes out today as a theme. And then a few kind of contemporary collecting dilemmas, just to kind of wrap up, issues that some of these aren't unique to contemporary collecting, but can be accentuated in different ways, whether it's in relation to ownership and copyright, especially with digital objects. The work that some of the people involved in the network did during COVID around ethics of contemporary collecting and slowing down rapid response during COVID-19 in terms of doing that in an ethical way. And there's at least one paper today talking about COVID-related collecting, which still, I think, features quite large in work or in our memories of recent contemporary collecting work. There's questions of who should be involved in which ways contemporary collecting should be participatory, and then also this some questions around process versus product. So thinking about contemporary collecting, we think of it as being maybe a collections development strategy or an aspect of collections development, but it's also a potential strategy for community development in terms of working in participatory ways, collecting people's objects and people seeing themselves and maybe quite literally their things represented in museum collections. And so, depending on how we design our contemporary collecting project, we might emphasize the process of collecting collaboratively with communities, developing those relationships. That might be how the aspect we prioritize in our project, or it might be more about creating those representative collections as well. And so, looking at your abstracts for today, I created a word cloud with kind of pulling out keywords. And some of these, it's always interesting when you write an abstract for a conference, you're obviously trying to convince the conference organizers that they should want your abstract. And so you work to fit your work into the theme of the conference. And so some of these contemporary and power being keywords in the call for papers for this event today. But I also thought it was interesting to note a few of the words that are kind of in bold in the center of the screen that weren't explicitly mentioned in the call for papers, which I think also says something about the type of focus that will be around some of the presentations today. And so three of those that I thought I'd highlight were engagement, protest, and community, quite near the center of the top of the screen, which as far as I could see, weren't introduced in the call for papers, but do feature quite centrally in the abstracts for the papers today. So it's going to be really interesting to see your perspectives on community engagement in the context of contemporary collecting, and also work around protest, which links to power. But we may also see papers around power in terms of that, the process and power relations in the process of contemporary collecting, but also maybe in relation to power relations in society and to collecting protest, and maybe even collecting as protest. And yeah, we'll see. I'm really looking forward to seeing the directions you take the work in. Thank you very much.